I have the utmost pleasure to present to you Professor Lucinda Fonseca, one of the co-applicants of the THEMIS project. I was wondering, Lucinda, now looking back at the 3 years of the project, what is the particular question you're grappling with now? What is the work you do with the THEMIS data at the moment?
Well, given the impacts of the economic crisis in Portugal, I'm particularly interested in looking at the impact that the economic crisis have in the migrants' action, in the transmission of negative feedback mechanisms, and how this is shaping the development of migration flows, not only into Portugal but also to other European countries. And this brings me to another very important question, which is the role of the EU in the role it has in shaping this kind of movements. And we should look at this broad context to understand the changes in the dynamics in specific corridors, because otherwise I think it's impossible to understand all the dynamics of the systems we are looking at. And another question which puzzled me as a geographer is to look at the appropriate scale of analysis to understand these dynamics and these changes. Of course, when we introduce the contextual factors, of course, the state level is important, but there are big differences in opportunities in different localities, both in the origin countries and in the destination countries. But then, when we look at the migration systems dynamics into Europe, we have this European context. And this introduces a new important questions, because despite, and once again, looking at a particular position of Portugal in this European migration systems, because despite the effect of the crisis, there are still some opportunities for specific migrants. So the issue of inequalities is really very, very, very important. So I really looking at the data and combining the dynamics of immigration into Portugal, but also the immigration of Portuguese, more and more I'm convinced that the issue of social inequalities is becoming a key issue to understand the processes.
From that perspective, I can see that the keynotes are really speaking to your data and you really respond in your analysis. I wanted to ask you a little bit about Portugal. I was speaking to Cindy a little bit earlier within the notes, and she was talking about Norway as a peripheral country. I mean, we can't call Portugal a peripheral country, but we could call it a country that has fairly recently become a migrant receiving country. Would you see this was a particular advantage of including Portugal in the THEMIS project? Would the data say this?
Well, I think yes, because Portugal became recently a country of immigration, but it keeps being a country of immigration. Only in the 90s, the number of migrants who came into Portugal was higher than the Portuguese who were leaving the country. But immigration was always there. And now, if we look at the outflows, they reach more than 100,000 a year. And the system changed completely because we moved from the undocumented migrants of the 60s, and lower skilled Portuguese young people left the country to the highly skilled. And if you look at the migrants who arrived to Portugal, of course now because they don't have job opportunities in Portugal, and it's, I would say, the most important driving force to understand the migration dynamics in Portugal, but the ones who have really a job, who have access to services, goods, to a certain way of life, they really intend to stay in Portugal and bring in their families. So, despite this economic environment, there are still migrants coming in and new waves, simply because Portugal as a peripheral country is an entrance toward into Europe. So we must look at the dynamics of the corridors, including also this notion of access to migration and access to the first choice destination. And Portugal is peripheral because, according to our data, is in most cases a second choice destination. It's the case for the Brazilians. But in certain cases, yes, but they come, if we look at the students, and university students, and there are many coming because there are opportunities given the fact that the Brazilian government has a huge program of scholarships and so on to study abroad. So they would prefer to go to the UK, but they don't speak English, so they speak their language. Once they arrive to Portugal, they start learning English, and then maybe they move. But so that's one important issue to consider. But if we look at from a political perspective and the opportunities to migrate, it's impressive that development of the migration from the Ukraine to Portugal. Most of the pioneers who came to Portugal, they didn't have an idea where Portugal was, the opportunities and so on. They would like to go to Germany or to other European country, but they had information about the possibilities to get a job in Portugal, to stay undocumented, a very friendly environment in the country. So, in fact, I think that Portugal was really a very interesting case to include in our research to understand the complexity of the processes. And in fact, the big impact that migration had in social transformation in Portugal and the reposition of Portugal in the European space. So once again, the notion of interconnections between different places is really very important. And the need, I think it's quite clear in the case of Portugal, to look at the migration dynamics using a multi-scale approach. So
that's something I also wanted to ask you, because you were cherished within the THEMIS team as the excellent methodological persona within the THEMIS project. Would you like to say a little bit more about your experiences of the different methodologies that were explored?
Yeah, and I think it was fascinating, this experience of using respondent-driven sampling. As you perhaps remember in the kick-off meeting, I was very pessimistic.
Critical, definitely.
Very critical about using art, yes. I was always supporting random sampling methods, but given the limited resources we had to conduct a survey, I was convinced, of course, and that you should try this new methodology. And in the end, I must admit that I'm not convinced at all. I'm not. In the case of Portugal, and I followed all the application of the survey, and I've participated in all the phases of the fieldwork, both in Portugal and in Brazil. And my experience is that it can be a very important and useful tool when we are looking to populations that we don't know anything about, with very difficult access. So to do some exploratory analysis, I think that's very useful. In the case of Portugal, given the knowledge we already have about the Brazilian migrants or the Ukrainians, and giving the diversity of Brazilians, I think the outcome is not that good. Well, we have tried to find a way to fight against the bias. And another problem in the specific case of Portugal was the effect of economic crisis, because people were queuing to be interviewed. And of course, this had an impact. In the case of the Ukrainians, it worked pretty well because it's a more homogeneous group. And in the case of Moroccan, I would say that the result is excellent because we managed to change a little bit the way we operationalize the survey. And because it's a small community, we didn't know much about it. But instead of having a fixed site location to make the interviews, we followed the migrants. I would say that we have interviewed almost 50% of the migrants. So I think the result is excellent because we adapted it a little bit to the circumstances.
Thank you very much, Lucinda.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.